Yeah, it is really awesome when an employee gets X and a CEO gets 37X. Yeah, that's awesome, right? Yeah. So again, like these are like the child, like when you're like, maybe you are a 10-year-old dude. I don't even know if you're allowed on Twitch if you're making arguments that are this fucking immature, right? So of course a CEO is going to make a fuck ton more than a low-level employee. What is his name? Sam Walton? Is that the owner of Walmart? Is that this guy's name? If this guy were to get on Twitter right now and spam the N-word, okay, how many millions of people would have their wages impacted? How many millions of shareholders would have their portfolios tank? How many millions of jobs that are related to Walmart could be grossly impacted? The CEO of a company has the ability to potentially single-handedly destroy a company. Of course, somebody like that is going to be compensated at a much higher level than a line-level employee. Like, yeah, CEOs get paid a fuck ton more than employees, but they also have the ability to do an incredible amount of harm to the company. There are millions of jobs potentially, maybe not millions, but oftentimes thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of jobs that are resting on some of these companies. All right, we're chatting with Exskillsme real quick. I'm sure this will be a real quick, really simple, agreeable conversation.
How's it going, man?
My favorite disingenuous fuck from my subreddit and chat.
I am ingenuous. Don't be so indigenous.
Okay, let's go. Hit me up with them Bernie communism memes.
No, because I think it's a good time to talk about this, because I think a lot of people, especially people who are here transiently, haven't been here long, are going to be kind of surprised that your stalwart defense of capitalism, even despite that, you actually supported Bernie Sanders in the primary. And I know the reason you did, but I don't know if everybody does. So for context, I just want to ask you, as the last liberal capitalist, why did you support Bernie Sanders?
So, for me, the single most important issue plaguing American politics today is the presence of corporate money in the political world. That is something that I think is a cancer on our system that makes it impossible for the representatives that we have in Congress to truly represent us as citizens. And Bernie spoke to that issue. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to make a claim. The claim I'm going to make is that if what you said is true, then Bernie Sanders is the last candidate and perhaps one of the last politicians in the entire country that you should support to be president.
Okay, why is that?
So I'll explain it in a few dimensions. And the first way I want to explain is by explaining to you in the chat, which I think a lot of people don't understand, is basically how the political economy works and how it functions. Because you talk about money and politics as a cancer, and I guess you could call it a cancer, but really what it is it functions as its own market. There's a supply and demand relationship for regulation, and the same way there's a supply and demand relationship for other goods and services. And I think the best way to actually explain this is to bring up an illustration you gave somebody else when you were discussing the manner in which the market incorporates relevant information in pricing a stock. Remember that talk you had a little while ago when you were talking about
that based on future earning potentials and whatnot, people will price that into their current evaluation for any security.
And that was beautiful. That was like spot on. Wow. And you actually drew a curve in Paint where you're like, okay, here's kind of like the baseline stock price, right? And for example, if there's some legislation that would bump their stock price up by 10%, and there's a 20% chance of that legislation passing, then the stock price is going to be higher than the baseline, but it's not going to be all the way up to the impact of that regulation, right?
Sure.
Well, that's really key visualization, because if you understand that dynamic, you understand why there is an influence of money in politics. Basically, when you're talking about the deviation between that baseline stock price and the price that it would be after that regulation is passed, that's pure money on the table. In fact, there's a word for that. It's called economic rents. That's all rent that is on the table for firms to try and capture.
Economic rent? Is that what you call it?
Yes, economic rents.
Okay.
And the act of trying to capture those economic rents is called the rent-seeking behavior. So you can imagine.
Does this rent-seeking behavior, is this specifically applied to politics, or is this just in a general term?
It's specific for this in the political economy.
Okay.
But people who use it more generally, oftentimes rents is like kind of synonymous with profits. But economic rents in this case is actually very specific. Okay. And basically, rent-seeking behavior defines the behavior that firms take in capturing those rents. Because you can imagine there's a gap between the baseline and the world with this legislation, right? So the extent to which corporations can either increase the probability of that legislation passing or change some aspects of that legislation to alter its impact on their market share, they get a return on their money for making investments and changing that. Do you accept that? You understand that?
Yeah, of course. So just so I can give an example so that I make sure I understand, everybody understands, but mainly so I understand, you're saying that there are two worlds. One world in which a firm earns $2,000 of revenue and another world in which the firm earns $1,000 of revenue. The difference between those two worlds might be some arbitrary legislation, and the difference between those would be described as a rent. Rent-seeking behavior would be to invest money in politics that's less than the $1,000 difference that would net you that $1,000 difference, and then the difference of those differences would be the profit earned by that lobbying, essentially, right?
Exactly. That is spot on. Okay. And so the problem with that type of behavior is, like you said, it's ethically dubious. But even the bigger problem with that is you have these large firms who pay a ton of money and invest a lot in capturing that rent. And the problem with economic rents like that is that the companies are getting wealth, but they're not actually creating any wealth. They're not like building a better product. And they could be using that money for things like investing in research and development and for hiring workers, giving workers raises. But instead, they're dedicating that money to capturing that rent on the table. Mm-hmm. So what you can see with this and what you just said is that the incentives these companies have to invest in that rent is proportional to the amount of money on the table. So if you have a regime like, dare I say, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who claim that they were going to basically manhandle all aspects of the economy. To give you an example, Bernie Sanders says he's going to break up the big banks.
No, Bernie didn't actually say that. Bernie actually specifically said that he would leave that up to regulators who thought it was appropriate if it was going. I actually very specifically remember an interview because I was actually shocked that he said this. I remember a specific interview. Somebody asked, "Would you break up these large financial institutions?" And Bernie said, "No, I would leave it to the appropriate federal agencies."
All right, I'm going to Skype you his campaign website or berniesanders.com/issues. And it has in big bold letters, it's time to break up the largest financial institutions in the country, right front and center. And he doesn't say how he's going to do that. Frankly, he doesn't know how he would do that.
Sure. Okay. I guess like maybe it's a finer point. Maybe his administration would, but I guess he particularly wouldn't. So maybe it's a semantics. It's not really relevant, but.
Right. But okay. that's because right now in our hypotheticals, we're talking about like a piece of legislation, right?
Sure.
But now we're talking about an administration just totally fucking rearranging the entire industry based off whatever the regulators decide. Okay. So the amount of money on the table is going to be in the trillions of dollars. So the incentives that companies have to influence money in politics is proportional to the amount of impact that these regulators have on those businesses.
Of course.
So when you get somebody like Bernie Sanders who says it's time to break up the big banks, I guarantee you that's gonna create basically a golden age of lobbyists, because they all are gonna have to lobby to have whatever he wants to do done in such a way that benefits their shareholders the most. And the more active measurements he takes in these actual industries, the more money there is on the table for people, for companies to invest and influence it. You accept that, right?
That companies will always be trying to influence politics via rent-seeking behavior, right?
Not always. They will, to the extent that they get the return on their money.
Yeah.
And the return on their money is correlated basically with exactly how much impact these regulators are having on their bottom line.
Sure.
And we're talking about Bernie Sanders, who is going to have an impact on the bottom line based off regulatory choice. It's on a massive scale, probably unprecedented. So if you care about money in politics, you should really be concerned about managing the incentives that companies have to invest money in politics. And when you have somebody like Bernie Sanders with all of the reforms he's talking about and without a specific actual way of doing that, how he says he's going to leave it up to regulators. It's like, what do you think lobbying is? These lobbyists don't go directly to the president. They go to the regulators and say, look, you're trying to do this. This is the way you should do it. And it so happens the way you should do it is best for our bottom line. And when you have somebody like Bernie Sanders, that's where I'm saying the contradiction lies, is that if you're really concerned about it, then you should say something like, well, Bernie Sanders' Wall Street reform would be absolutely massive and it's very vague. So if I care about money in politics, I don't want that kind of vague, large rent-seeking incentive to be on the table. It's totally opposite.
Okay, we're missing a pretty important part here, though, aren't we?
Okay. Well, let me know.
Well, there's two big things, okay? One, I reject your argument that eliminating rent-seeking behavior, or that eliminating the rent, that eliminating that is good, but we can talk about that later. The main thing is that Bernie said that he wanted to prohibit people from being able to lobby politicians. That was like a big part of his platform. Okay.
So how is he going to do that?
I don't know. There's a number of reforms.
But I mean, you said this is the most important thing to you. So like, what's he going to do? Like, how is he going to limit lobbying?
I don't know. Maybe private companies, or the whole idea of super PACs is probably not a good thing. I don't know. It's a really tenuous issue that has to be navigated. But the idea that companies can dump pretty much unlimited amounts of money or support into a political campaign in order to influence an outcome is probably not okay. I
mean, I know. I guess my critique would be, it seems like you say it's like a single issue thing for you. So I would expect more concrete, like, oh, this is step A, this is step B.
Lobbying has its hands in like every single part of the government. I mean, companies will fund individual political campaigns via super PACs and whatnot. That stuff like that should probably not be allowed. Companies have their hands in writing legislation that they hand off to senators to insert into bills. That should not be allowed. I mean, lobbying is a fucking massively huge thing.
Yeah, and I just explained to you why that's the case.
Yeah, I understand why that's the case.
How would you go about stopping it? I'm saying that the way you stop that is by managing the amount of economic rents on the table.
Okay,
not necessarily minimizing, because you have to have some rents. There's some regulation is necessary.
Of course.
So you're always going to have economic rents.
Well, yeah, which is why I reject your rent argument. No.
That was not my argument, though.
Okay.
My argument was not that you should minimize economic rents. It's that you should not maximize them if your goal is to limit the influence of money in politics, because that's a competing goal.
One suggestion that I've heard, and I don't know, I would have to look into the feasibility of these alternative systems, although I'd love to look into them more if it was ever realistic. I don't think it is right now. But like one suggestion would be like a public fund that politicians draw from. So for instance, if you're running in a particular city, you guys have voted with your city council, whatever bullshit, for like each politician is allowed to spend $50,000 or whatever for their advertising for this quarter or whatever the season, for this political season, something like that, where the funds would be publicly delegated to the officials.
But we're also talking about another aspect of lobbying, which lobbying, a lot of it isn't actually money or donations. A lot of it is literally these lobbyists going, and that's where the term came from. They go to the lobbies of the hotels, of the regulators, and of the corporations and make a pitch, or of the politicians make a pitch for why they should consider a certain bill. So the problem with limiting lobbying is you have fundamentally a free speech issue, and that's in fact.
I don't think there's anything wrong with pitching things, but the problem isn't necessarily pitching things. The problem is the bribery. So let me give an example. If somebody were to come and say something like, I think that coal is really good for the United States, and I really think you should look into this because we can provide a lot of value to the American people or whatever, like a pitch like that, I wouldn't really have a problem with.
But that's the problem, is when you say lobbying, that encompasses mostly that.
Okay, I'm not talking about those types of behaviors. What I'm talking about is a behavior where somebody might say, listen, I think that you should vote in favor of this coal bill. If you don't, my company is leaving your state. Or like, we're not going to be involved with you, or we're going to give you some sort of kickback if you do vote in the way that we want, whether that's paying for political action campaigns or paying for donations to other types of things or whatever, or special interest bullshit.
So, I mean, I guess in my state, we've had like the governors cut deals with large companies, and Amazon. Like, do you think Amazon should be banned for doing what they're saying, where they're basically like, hey, we're opening new headquarters. I want these cities with these specifications to give us like their pitch on why they should be there and to give us basically the best deal possible. To me, that's exactly what you're talking about, but I think that's economically efficient, and I don't see an ethical issue with that, but it seems like that should be banned under what you're proposing.
I guess at like the particular issues, I guess I'm generally concerned at the federal level, but I guess there would be state-related things. I don't know if I would view like tax cuts or preferential treatment to businesses coming to a state in the same line as like this is how federal legislation should change to benefit like a certain business over another business. I guess I would have to think more about the finer points. I know right now, do you acknowledge that rent-seeking behavior like causes a lot of really bad things to happen in our economy, right? That's like a failure that isn't accounted for at the moment?
Oh, I explained it, yeah, because that's money that could be spent towards R&D or product development or customers, and instead it's kind of like sunk into just capturing wealth. Well,
not only that also, but the rent-seeking behavior can manifest in actual negative ways for society as well, that a company could perform in a negative way that reduces the, reduces a competitive product available to a person, not just because they're not investing the money in R&D, but because they're making other people uncompetitive, or in externalities like environmental impact or other shit like that kind of stuff is really negative.
And what I described, that falls under the umbrella of what I described. We're talking about
when you say or I'm sorry, so I guess just to finish this topic up real fast, I don't know exactly how. I haven't looked into the exact implementations. I say that I'm a single issue on this, much the same way that I would say that like I think voting reform is absolutely 100% necessary. I think that first past the post is a disgusting way to vote. I don't know what the best alternative is, but I haven't spent much time thinking of like the exact specifics of this, just because I don't consider it realistic. I don't think that anybody is realistically talking about getting money out of politics, so it's just not something I've looked into that much.
Right, and that's why I really think it was wrong of you to support Bernie Sanders. That's why I don't think you should.
Well, but I still think so we can talk about the rent stuff in particular if you want to move on to that, or if you had a final thing to say, go for it.
Lastly, I was going to say, because I guess you kind of solved for this by saying that by lobbying you don't mean companies actually going directly to politicians and basically making a pitch for. But that's actually necessary and important, and the reason for that is that Bernie Sanders doesn't know fuck all about banking. He knows nothing about it. And even the regulators, they know more about banking, but they don't know about the specific idiosyncrasies of individual banks.
Okay.
So it's actually important for banks to basically represent their interests and go to these politicians and say, hey, look, you're thinking about doing it this way. Here's why it's not fair. And a lot of the times, like, they're actually right. Like, the rules aren't fair.
Yeah, but you have to be careful because the banks are only representing their businesses. They're not necessarily representing what's best for all of America. They're just representing what would be best for their particular business, even if that might not be.
That's why their input is important, because those regulators, they have no incentive to make a decision that is best for everybody. They're driven by political motivations. Corporations are driven by their shareholders. So the problem
if
is
those political motivations are like getting reelected or maintaining the will of the people that voted for you, whatever, I think that those political motivations are better for society than maximizing profit for shareholders.
Sorry, repeat that?
If your motivation, if you have two people and one person's motivation is political, like, I need to do this to get elected again because most people agree with this, versus I need to do this to maximize value for the shareholders of this company, I would rather the former than the latter.
Man, that is, I would absolutely 100% dispute that. And for what reason is political self-interest somehow more noble or more laudable than economic self-interest?
Because political self-interest is revolved around representing constituents in your country, and profit self-interest can represent a very, very, very minute.
But is political self-interest, aren't regulators, isn't that political self-interest? Is that based off the interests of the well-being of the population or the constituency, or is it based off maximizing their own individual political power?
Well, but the way that you gain political power is to gain popularity through your constituency, no?
Yeah, exactly, and that's basically the problem with that, is that they have no incentive to do. They have no incentive to do what's economically efficient or, frankly, morally right. That all their incentive to do is to basically do what their voters want them to do, and that means that there's no way for them, if they're going to pursue bad legislation that totally fucks up the banking industry. If voters want that, then that's going to happen, and there's no recourse.
Okay, yeah, so we got to be careful because we can get into like failures of democracy here. So like, I guess in an ideal world where I believe that democracy works, if you have two politicians, one who's only trying to grow their political clout by fucking the economy over, and another one who wants to grow their political clout by growing the economy, you would hope that the guy trying to grow the economy.
We both know that. We both know that doesn't work. We both know the shortcomings of democracy.
Sure, but we're having fundamentally different realities if one of us believes that democracy works and one of us doesn't believe in democracy.
I disagree. I think the fundamental disagreement we have is that you think if regulators are purely driven by political motivation, they'll somehow do a better job than one in which regulators are basically driven by economic bottom line and shareholder accountability. I totally reject that. I think voters are far more irrational and far more biased than shareholders are.
Sure, but both of us can play this game then. Like, if you want to give the ideal world for profit-driven people, that's always going to work out over the messy world of real-life politics. If I want to give the ideal world of politicians, that's always going to work over the messy world of short-term profits maximized for shareholders.
Maybe what I'm saying is the optimal world is a middle ground where you have regulators are ultimately beholden to voters, but at the same time, organizations are still able to represent their interests in front of their regulators.
I'm generally a middle ground type of person, sure. I don't think that...
But Bernie Sanders is not that middle ground. Bernie Sanders is the extreme where he says, he doesn't say how, but he doesn't want corporations to be able to represent themselves in front of regulators or in front of politics. And a lot of people don't want that either.
I don't know. I don't necessarily know if Bernie would have gone like to the extreme of that, but I do know that Bernie was the only person that talked about it. And I also know that if Bernie had gotten into office, there's no way that he's getting rid of every single amount. Like, he's not single-handedly marching up to the Supreme Court and overturning Citizens
United.
Hear me out
here.
Yep.
Hear me out here. I'm not trying to be too hard on you, but this sounds like so much like when you bring a Trump supporter on and you talk about all like the shitty things Trump wants to do. I'm like, yeah, you know what? But he's talking about this. Maybe I don't know the exact right way he's going to do it, but he's not going to be a dictator. I guess.
Whoa, no, stop. No, I can't let you walk on that. No, I can't let you walk on that. So the problem with Trump is that what Trump wants to do, in my opinion, is bad, and what Trump is doing, in my opinion, is bad. For Bernie with wanting to reduce the amount of corporate influence in politics, I consider that to be a good thing. So the path there, I consider to be overwhelmingly positive.
So when he says he wants to break up the largest financial institutions in the concept,
I'm not entirely sure about that. So Bernie himself,
it's on his website. I sent you a link on Friday.
I would have to go and find like the specific interview. This is so maybe he said that his administration wants to. I'm not entirely sure what his administration would have deemed appropriate for breaking up large banks, and I don't even know what the correct answer is on that. I don't necessarily agree with you that those institutions should be left alone. I don't know if that's the correct choice or not. I would have to look more into that. But the path that Bernie would take towards removing lobbying from the government, I would consider those steps to be overwhelmingly positive. Nothing that Trump is doing, I would consider to be positive.
You said remove lobbying for government, but we've just explained how a large portion of lobbying is probably right and economically efficient, and frankly, they should have the right to do it. But now you're like, you keep fluctuating. Like,
so this is what you do in every argument that I have on my subreddit. No. So this is what you're doing. It's really funny. Okay. So like there are forms of lobbying that exist that you know that I would probably be okay with. You know this, and I know this, and I know that you know this, and you know that I know that you know this. But you're going to sit here and pretend, Destiny, you're saying that if Coca-Cola just wants to send a letter advocating that sugar shouldn't be banned, they shouldn't be allowed to do that because that's lobbying? You know that I don't think that kind of stuff should be completely eliminated, okay? You also know that there are forms of lobbying because you've conceded this. You know that there are forms of lobbying that are harmful to the public, that there are rent-seeking behaviors that are harmful to the public. You know this. Okay.
Here's my question for you. Why do you continue to mischaracterize lobbying? You just said, you can clip it, you said what Bernie Sanders wants to do is good because he wants to get lobbying out of politics. But
because most of the lobbying behavior that we're talking about and that Bernie Sanders is talking about was usually pretty destructive lobbying behavior. The idea that a private company can approach somebody...
What's your distinction between destructive lobbying behavior and normal lobbying behavior?
It's something way past fucking getting rid of all regulation from the banks to set up like a housing crisis. It's something way past like Intuit telling people they're not allowed to have the government fill out their taxes. That's a good argument. What is too much lobbying? But we're way fucking far past that point.
You're the one being disingenuous about the definition of lobbying. You're the one playing fast and loose with it. I'm the one trying to say, if we're talking about lobbying, let's talk about a concept that encompasses these things or it doesn't. Don't go back and forth.
No. If you want to do that, that's fine. We can have a long discussion on like what behaviors should be accepted and what behaviors don't. But that's not what you did. You came in here saying, well, you're against lobbying, so you must be against every single possible form of lobbying that ever existed.
Lobbying includes that. That's why getting rid of all lobbying isn't a good solution. I didn't accuse you of being against that. I said that's the reason why you shouldn't support Bernie Sanders. But if you agree with me that there is a large portion of lobbying that probably should be allowed and probably does actually benefit the economy, and does benefit the ideas of representative democracy. If you agree with that, I'm asking you to draw the distinction where Bernie should be, because I don't think Bernie draws that distinction.
I feel like maybe this is just a feels argument. Maybe if Bernie would have had more time on stage, maybe he would have laid this out more. I feel like Bernie's distinction wasn't or wouldn't have been, we need to get rid of every single possible influence that the corporate sector could have on politics. I don't feel like Bernie...
Do you know the facts of the case of Citizens United?
What about it?
Citizens United was airing a documentary about Hillary Clinton.
Yep, I know. Yep.
Yeah, you know that, right?
Yeah.
And I think I've talked to you about this before, but I know Bernie Sanders does. He disagrees with that decision. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So you're trying to tell me that Bernie Sanders, when he talks about lobbying, he's only talking about basically bribes. I'm saying that Bernie has a larger umbrella. Well, look at this case of Citizens United. That was a documentary. That was basically speech. That wasn't a bribe. That was just airing a documentary. So that clearly falls outside the umbrella of lobbying that you think Bernie Sanders is exclusive to, when obviously he's not.
I never defined exactly what Bernie Sanders lobbying would be exclusive to. Would it cover things like Citizens United? Obviously, he's made statements about that. Sure,
but most Citizens United should have been allowed. That was a documentary. Documentary isn't a bribe.
There are problems with that. There are problems with the idea that, like, well, if I'm not directly supporting a candidate, I should be able to dump trillions of dollars into propaganda that favors that candidate, right? That the entire existence of super PACs and whatnot, there are a fuck ton of problems that emerge from that are incredibly destructive to our society.
See, you're accusing me of being disingenuous. I'm just trying to find out where you draw the line, because before it seemed like it was like basically bribes what we're talking about, but now we're talking about documentary.
So let's do it. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so I think that there are forms of influence that companies have on politicians that are cancerous to their abilities to make decisions.
Hey, that's very generic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is very generic. So if a company is contributing a fuck ton of dollars to a person's campaign or is helping them get elected, and that person is changing the way that they view legislation, not to make anything better for anybody, but just to get votes from that company, like, this is kind of general, but like the specific example that I usually go to would be like the Intuit thing. That's something that I'm intimately familiar with, where Intuit supports certain politicians, and those politicians make it illegal for the federal government to pre-populate their tax forms. This doesn't benefit anybody in American society. In fact, it makes our life strictly worse off, and people only do it because they're getting paid money by these politicians. You could argue that a lot of like Glass-Steagall related stuff or Dodd-Frank, that a lot of these bills are also influenced by corporations that give money to certain politicians to make sure that there are certain regulations that don't make it through, or that do make it through, that benefit these banks. These are forms of lobbying that don't benefit everybody. They only benefit the private companies and the shareholders that are lobbying on behalf of those private companies and shareholders. That kind of stuff, I think, is a really bad thing that fucks with our political system.
But I'm still trying to... I'm still failing to see where you draw the line between, like, you think the documentary should be banned, you think direct lobbying should be banned, but like when you say that in what was the name of that company that made the tax reform company? I'm not too familiar with that. Well, yeah, into it. Well, are you saying that they shouldn't be allowed to go to the regulators and pitch a PowerPoint deck that says, "Oh, hey, here, if you pass this, and these are the consequences. Here's why this legislation should pass." You think that should be banned, or should that be allowed?
Pitching something like that seems fine to me, but it's when you say, "Hey, can you do this? Also, we're going to donate $300,000 to like these types of advertising campaigns for you." Like, that's not cool. That's not okay.
Okay, so pitching that is fine. You don't think that should be banned?
No, I don't think so.
And you think Bernie Sanders would allow that to stay?
Yes, I do. Maybe I'm being naive, but I can't see Bernie saying that like we shouldn't let companies advertise to Congress at all. Like, yeah.
So now this form of lobbying, where you air a documentary, you publish a documentary, that should also be banned. And why should that be banned?
I think that if you're using if you're using private funds to do like hardcore funding for like campaigns and stuff, that just gets into like a really weird...
What if it's not funding? What if it's just purely like, hey, here's a documentary? That's not advocating for funding or anything. That's just information. That's just speech.
Sure. So I don't know the exact answer here, and I know that you're hardcore going to push me for one, and if I don't give you the exact fucking answer, you're going to go off into the extreme on the other direction, but you're incredibly disingenuous. I can't give you something reasonable, but what we're at right now is this is like we're arguing over what is the correct number. Is it 548 or is it 572? And you're like, and I'm like, well, I don't know exactly what the right number is. And you're like, okay, well, 500 million is the right number then. Like, this is how you do your arguments, okay? So I don't know what the correct, I don't know what the correct,
give me the answer to the question.
I don't know what the exact amount of lobbying should be. I don't know what the exact amount of lobbying should be allowed. But if you've got a company that's investing millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into making documentaries for a certain political figure, that's going to have a predictable outcome on a population's voting thing.
Hey, do you think how expensive was a documentary Citizens United air? Does millions and millions really matter? What if it's just a couple 100,000? What if it's 10,000? Should it be allowed then? Is that really the criteria you use?
How much money do you think was raised by super PACs during the last election season? Do you know that? Do you know that number?
I asked you how much money you think was invested.
I don't know what the exact answer is. You're right, dude. I'm sorry. I think that you should be able to put unlimited, because I can't give you an exact number. You should be able to put unlimited amounts of money because it's a free speech issue.
Well, that's what the court said. That's
I agree. Yeah, and you should be able to put unlimited amounts of private funds, because I can't give you the exact number down to like the $1,000 mark that it should be.
What I'm saying is that, do you really base it off, like, I'm asking you if it's true or not. Like, does the number really matter? Like, what if it's a cheap documentary? Does it matter? Like, I'm not asking for an exact number.
I mean, like, the number could be specific towards markets. I don't know. It could be related to the public fund that we said that politicians could. Maybe your public fund is $100,000 to run for a certain city or whatever, a certain district. And if people want to contribute certain advertising campaigns to you, they would either have to pool that money and make a single thing, or it would be limited to a certain amount. I don't know how exactly it would play out in the real world. I'm not sure.
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you. You said that it's wrong for people. You're saying that Citizens United documentary was wrong, and the reason it was wrong because people shouldn't be able to spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars.
I didn't say that the Citizens United documentary itself was wrong. I'm not familiar with how much money was specifically spent on that or how influential that was. What I'm against is the idea of the existence of like...
on how much money was spent on it?
To some extent, sure. Yeah, how influential something is what we're really talking about when we talk about money spent on it, sure.
Okay, well, it seems like we're under extremely lofty territory here for an issue you say is the most important to you, but it seems like we're extremely vague on what type of lobbying should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed, and it depends on how much money and how influential it is on the public. Mm-hmm. My only point is that it seems like it's basically the counterpart to the Trumpists who say they have this vague notion of something Trump's going to do, and you can't really tie them down exactly onto what they mean or exactly how he's going to do it. Yep. They just have kind of a feeling that he's taking the right approach and he's the one talking about it. Yep. So he's going to do that. Yep. Whereas again, even if we're talking about all of this and we're talking about the type of lobbying you hate, you must recognize, getting back to my explanation of how the political economy works, is that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and their agenda lends itself most to that type of lobbying you dislike. Do you accept that?
That lends itself to that type of lobbying that you dislike?
It incentivizes that type of lobbying the most because it creates the most economic rents. Do you dispute that?
Wait, I'm sorry, can you say it one more time?
Yes. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's political agenda. Their agenda lends itself to the most political rents and therefore the most incentives for big businesses to actually put money.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So if your goal is to mitigate the direct type of corrupt lobbying that you don't like, whatever that is, if your goal is to mitigate that, then mitigating the incentives for that to take place should be a priority for you.
No,
but instead, you
absolutely no, because that argument is just invalid.
It's true.
No, it's absolutely an invalid argument. So you're saying, so what you're essentially saying is let's construct a world where a company can make $10,000 by polluting the environment, or a regulation could exist that would make it so the company would only make $5,000 to pollute the environment. Now we're having an argument where you're saying, well, if you really want to get rid of lobbying, you just need to let the company pollute the environment, and then now we solve the lobbying problem by reducing the rent-seeking behavior. I absolutely reject that argument.
No, I'm not saying that you absolutely totally minimize it. I'm saying that you manage it, because there's a far cry between saying, hey, this company is polluting this river for $10,000 and saying we're going to break apart large financial institutions. I sent you the link, and I don't know if you've looked at the link. Maybe you don't want to because it doesn't support your view. But there's a far cry between those two things. And the first thing is necessary. And there's going to be some lobbying there. And that's just going to be a fact of life. But when you talk about Bernie Sanders saying he's going to totally micromanage 20% of the U.S. economy, that's a far cry.
You're
from $20,000.
being disingenuous.
I'm not at all. It's
Micromanage.
100% true.
So because he thinks that there are some large institutions that shouldn't exist because of their failure would destroy the United States, that's called micromanaging.
Yes, breaking apart some banks willy-nilly and forcing them together.
So when like AT&T and Bell or whatever, when they were separated, was that micromanaging those organizations?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it was micromanaging those organizations, but unfortunately, we're not even talking about one organization. We're talking about the entire industry. That's in his words, not mine. You don't want to defend his position. You want to defend some position you imagine he has.
No, I understand why you want to. I don't. Okay. Yeah. All right. Anything else?
So true.
I don't know much about breaking up the banks because it's not an issue that we fucking talk about, and you're pushing it for like an exact, precise answer. Your argument here, whether or not the bank should be broken up, I don't even know if that should happen or not. That might. Yeah, it's an example, but it's an example that it's an example of something that you're pushing me on for a very hyper specific answer. Since I can't provide that answer, you want to run off to your extreme, like, oh well, you don't know exactly how the bank should be differentiated between. You don't know exactly. Well, then the answer is absolutely no regulation, or else you're a fucking idiot. Like that's what you're telling me. Like I don't know what the exact answer is.
You keep attributing that to me. I specifically said I'm not against no regulation. There has to be some regulation.
I'm not saying no.
My goal is
you're saying that Bernie wanting to break up the big banks is something that both of us should agree is bad. I don't know if that's bad or not.
Hey, even if you don't agree if it's bad, you have to agree that it incentivizes the sort of lobbying behaviors that you claim to hate.
Of course,
you can't deny that.
Any type of environment, but I reject the validity of your argument. Any type of environmental protection activity is going to incentivize rent-seeking behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean that I disagree with all of those types of regulations.
I know, and I said there's a far cry between those two things, between micromanaging the banks in a way that's absolutely
well, what is the exact line then? Tell me what the exact line is where you draw that rent-seeking behavior, Exskillsme.
Yeah, how about like 10% of GDP? But with the banking industry, the pharmaceutical industry, with the healthcare industry, we're talking about large proportions of GDP here. So my point is, you seem to care most about limiting the amount of money in politics. That, if in my mind, if you actually did care about limiting the influence of money in politics, you would say, okay, if we want to limit the influence of money in politics, we have to be really careful about the rents we put on the table. Sometimes when necessary, it's going to have to be there. But really, when it's not necessary, when it just gets way too much leeway to regulators, it creates too many incentives for companies to make these sorts of investments. But when you support Bernie Sanders, you're throwing that all out the window. You're just imagining some perfect world where he's going to break apart some institutions and merge other ones together. And it's not just the banking institution. It's also the healthcare, the pharmaceutical institution. It's basically almost every aspect of the economy. He's advocating for mass reform. And that reform is going to be left up to the discrepancy of the regulators. So if you really dislike money in politics, the last person you should support is somebody who gives so much discrepancy to regulators, who are the ones.
I've already rejected. I don't know. You keep putting forth the same argument that you want to get rid of lobbying. Well, if you regulate these industries, you're going to incentivize lobbying anymore. I've already rejected. I don't think that's a valid argument to make.
Okay. Well, let's slow down then. You disagree that greater regulation incentivizes a greater amount of that direct lobbying you dislike. Sure. Do you accept or reject that argument?
I accept that.
You accept that argument?
Yep.
So then you don't reject it, because that's the argument I'm making.
No. I accept that you cause the behavior to happen, but that doesn't mean that the regulations themselves are acceptable or not. You don't judge the value of a regulation by whether or not it incentivizes people to avoid the regulation. No,
I'm not trying to force you to take a position on the regulation themselves. You told me that your top priority is money in politics.
Okay, so hold on. Let me.
It's not your top priority. Okay. Now we're talking about if you're saying it depends on the validity of the regulation. It's like, well, obviously you don't care much about the influence of politics.
So my top priority in politics is actually, I guess, the regulations themselves. And then you would say, well, with the regulations, but those are contingent on how the economy is doing to some extent. Oh, well, my top priority then isn't the economy, or isn't the regulations. I guess it's the economy. Well, the economy is actually contingent on the happiness of the American population, because so actually your top, like, I mean, we can recursively play this all day if you want.
You're obfuscating things. Just let me crystallize.
Okay.
I'm saying that you are saying that money in politics is the thing you care about most. It's your single voting issue.
Yeah.
Yet you support a candidate that would generate the most incentive to invest in money in politics. That's a fact. You seem to accept that. Now, I'm not saying whether you should or shouldn't have it, but you should recognize that and reconcile it because it's true. It's 100%
I've already
true.
recognized and reconciled that, but I guess you reject the reconciliation.
Right. The way you've reconciled that is like, oh, maybe I agree with the regulations. It's like, okay, well, if you agree with the regulations and there's some sort of other criteria out there, then obviously you don't care about that issue as much as you pretend to.
Wait, what? Whoa! Okay, you're gonna walk me through your logic very, very closely. Okay, we're gonna go very slowly. Okay,
I will. So,
okay, so let me put your argument. Hold on, let me. Wait, no, I want to because I understand your argument.
You want to walk me through my? How about I walk you through?
No, I want to walk you through your argument. Okay.
Wait, no. How about I walk you through my logic? I don't want you to.
I already know your logic.
No, you don't. Oh, well, how about I walk you through my logic? I think that's pretty fair.
Okay.
It's fair.
Yep.
So tell me where my logical breakdown is.
Okay.
Stephen Bono.
Yes.
Money in politics is one of the most important things to you. It's like your single issue voting.
Yep.
Secondly, there's a certain candidate, and that candidate would incentivize the most money in politics. Do you agree with that? And the candidate is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders would incentivize money in politics to a greater degree than basically any other candidate. That's an indisputable point. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Therefore, those goals seem to be competing, and that I'm not saying you can't both support Bernie Sanders and care most about money in politics. I'm just saying if you support both of those at the same time, I feel like you have to have a very, very, very clear idea that I think you don't have of how you reconcile those two things. Now, you've tried to reconcile it at a much general, higher level sense by saying, well, if polluting a river and maybe I agree with regulations. But my point is, I don't think you've been able to even give a consistent, coherent view of what lobbying entails, because we've agreed that some lobbying is good and sub-lobbying is bad.
Okay, let's focus on one meme at a time, okay? Can we focus on one meme at a time?
Yep.
Okay, so Bernie, so I think that some forms of lobbying are destructive to the government, okay? We got that, right?
Yep.
Okay. I think that Bernie...
Can I ask you what those forms of lobbying are?
I don't know exactly every single way that lobbying...
Okay, so you don't know. Next
not exactly.
Next
no,
step.
Correct. That is correct, because this issue is not relevant to anything in current politics. So no, I don't know specifics, okay? So, I gave you a specific example earlier with Intuit, but you weren't familiar with it. But, okay, so... There are some forms of lobbying that are destructive to the United States, okay? I acknowledge that and I accept that. Bernie wants to restrict, I would hope, the most destructive forms of lobbying. Now, Bernie would also enact regulations that would in some ways incentivize lobbying, but the step that you keep missing is that Bernie said that he wanted to make those forms of lobbying illegal. So even if you're incentivizing that behavior would be made outlawed.
So how would he make those illegal? You don't know the answer to that question.
Well, it would depend on the specific forms of lobbying that we're talking about.
You don't know any of this, dog.
Okay,
you don't. It's like a Trump supporter. When he
it's
says
not a Trump supporter. Trump is the president right now. When Trump is enacted, if you want to talk about specific Trump policies, we can talk about it. But I can't give you the exact details on a guy that was running for office that didn't even win the Democratic ticket.
You just told me Sanders would make those kinds of lobbying illegal, but you can't tell me how he would do that.
Okay.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
And so since I can't give you those specifics on Bernie's thing,
it's okay for you to do that, but it's not okay for Trump supporters to do that.
What's the difference between talking about Bernie policies versus the current president of the United States? I don't know, my dude.
If you supported him, you should be able to tell me how he would do it.
I should be able to go into detail.
I think that's a fair bar.
That would be like if I was criticizing, if I'm criticizing, why am I allowed to criticize the Republican healthcare program right now, or the Republicans' attempts to reform healthcare? How can I criticize that when I can't give you the exact breakdown of how Bernie wanted to do single payer? I can't do that either. So that means I shouldn't say anything about Trump's current healthcare system, right?
A better analogy would be saying I support the Republicans because they're going to improve healthcare, and then you ask, well, how are they going to improve healthcare? And you say, oh, I don't know, fucking don't tell me, blah blah blah.
Except the Republicans are trying to enact healthcare reform now.
Here's all I'm saying. If you're saying you support Bernie Sanders because he's going to ban certain types of lobbying you don't like, you should be able to explain how he's going to accomplish what you think he's going to. That's, I think, a fair question. And you can't answer that, but I think that's the standard you hold everybody else to. I honestly, I'm
not. When have I ever been talking about an ex-candidate? When was the last time I grilled somebody like, oh, well, how is Rubio or how is Cruz or how is Kasich going to? When was the last time that I grilled somebody specifically on this topic?
I think when somebody says, I support this candidate because they're going to do this. And you ask, okay, well, how are they going to do that? You do that all the time.
Yeah, when we're talking about people that are elected in power right now, so there's a huge difference.
It's different for them, but for me, it's different. Like, they have to answer it, but I don't have to answer that because Bernie didn't win. That's basically what you're telling me. I don't think that's good logic. I think if you supported him, you should be able to answer that question.
Okay. I should know the exact, every minutia of every detail of the platforms of people that ran in the past that are not relevant politically today. Gotcha.
if you supported Bernie because he's going to ban lobbying you don't like, I just interested in how you think he would do that, and you just seem to
I'm
not
not
know.
sure. If Bernie would have won his ticket, I probably would have did a lot more research.
But you support him before you knew then. That you have to
I
recognize
supported him
that.
over Hillary because I didn't like Hillary because she had a fuck ton of corporate money behind her, and I don't want somebody with a fuck ton of corporate money behind them over somebody that doesn't, that shares similar policy
Somebody
platforms.
who has like supports a $15 minimum wage, who is even more anti-international trade than Trump. But you
I
supported him.
don't know if he was more
despite those
anti-international trade than Trump. I'm not sure.
He is.
Yeah, he was a pretty big protectionist leader. I had problems with him, but over Hillary Clinton,
Exactly.
I would take him over Hillary Clinton.
So
But
my thing is, you have problems with him, but the reason you support him is because he's going to ban types of lobbying you don't like.
Sure.
When I ask you how he's going to do that, you say you don't have to know because he didn't win.
I say, no, I'm not saying I don't have to know. I'm saying that I don't know the specifics. I probably knew more about it a year ago, but it's so long ago, and the issue is just not relevant today that I don't know the specific forms of lobbying that exist that would have to be regulated right now.
I admit it makes the conversation harder if you can't tell me how he would do that. Because I'm maintaining that he couldn't. It's like the drug war, right? In order to reduce drugs, you have to get to the incentives of that, and it's very hard to do, right? You can't just like ban the sale of drugs and expect that to win the drug war. That's basically what you're talking about with like, oh, if we ban lobbying, then these large companies won't be able to put money in politics, and that's just not true. It's the same thing.
I reject that comparison. To ban the sale of drugs is impossible. Every single individual in the United States.
Banning lobbying is impossible too.
Banning lobbying would be more difficult, but there's far less people that you have to regulate and keep an eye on when it comes time to do lobbying things. It's way different than a private citizen versus a publicly elected official that could be held accountable to public standards. That's
not true. And you must understand. I don't know if you understand, but we're not even talking about public officials. We're talking about the litany of unregulated and largely unsupervised regulators. The turtles go all the way down. Those lobbyings aren't just at the top level, senators and even presidents.
Sure.
They go down to the regulators level.
Sure.
So,
but even regulators, there are far fewer
regulators
regulators in the country than there are people that could purchase a drug. That regulating a regulator is going to be easier than keeping a private citizen from purchasing.
That is such a silly comparison. There are a very large number of regulators who are unelected, lifelong bureaucrats, and it is much more difficult.
Do you think that it's the same? Okay. Do you think that it's the same order of magnitude of people that want to purchase drugs versus people that are in charge of regulating large companies in the United States?
I think that's an irrelevant comparison.
Okay.
Because they're totally different. Purchasing drugs and legislation and regulation are totally different things. And I guess here's my question: if it's so easy, I don't understand why you can't tell me how he would do it.
I never said it was easy. Healthcare isn't easy.
Okay,
I never said it was an easy thing. I just said no. When did I ever say it was easy? What?
Okay, so it's difficult then, right?
Yeah, of course it would be. Sure, you're talking about one of the most comprehensive overhauls of the American political system. Yeah, it would be huge.
I think that makes it even more reason for you. If you don't know how he's going to do it, and it's a difficult problem, it seems like you're just kind of putting your faith in him, but just because he's talking about it. It seems exactly like what Trump people do. It's like, I don't know how he's going to do it, but he says he's going to do it, and I trust him.
Okay, but the difference
is, if it's difficult, you should understand exactly how he's going to go about doing it.
Okay, I gotcha. All right, do you have any other final memes you want to bring up with the chat?
Yeah, just to crystallize. If you want more of a behavior, you subsidize it.
Yep.
If you want less of a behavior, you tax it.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about a politician like Bernie Sanders, whose agenda involves basically moving large portions of the economy on the whims of regulators, then what you're doing is you're creating incentives for companies to influence politics. And the extent to which regulators influence the economy increases the level of rent-seeking behavior you'll have. You'll have people like Destiny who promise you that Bernie Sanders will mitigate that and he'll stop it somehow. Won't exactly say how, but fundamentally it's not going to happen. If you incentivize something, if you subsidize it, you get more of it. So if you really want to get money out of politics, you should not support.
You need to get rid of all regulations. Was the converse?
No,
that's
I've never.
You said reduce rent-seeking behavior by getting rid of the regulations that cause rent-seeking behavior.
Do you think those two are the same thing? Mitigating economic rents and no regulations, are those the same thing?
Not no regulations, but they exist on a continuum that follows one another. Sure.
Wait, what? You said that you keep saying that I want to get rid of all regulations when I've never proposed
You're
that.
saying that proposing more regulations increases rent-seeking behavior. Therefore, the additional regulations are bad because they increase rent-seeking behavior.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying higher regulations it creates more incentive for money in politics. So if you care about mitigating money in politics, you'll be more careful about how you regulate the economy.
By having less regulations, right?
But or just more targeted regulations.
So less regulations.
Not necessarily less regulate.
Okay.
Less in terms of the pure amount of economic rents you're creating in that sense. But my point is that if you care about that, then you don't support a candidate who says he's going to do something like mobilize 20% of the economy, break up all of these banks, merge medical institutions or whatever. You can't support both those things at the same time.
I understand.
You have to be more
so
careful
like
about...
a really good like rent-seeking behavior would be somebody like Trump that wants to eliminate the EPA, because if the EPA doesn't exist, you've eliminated all sorts of rent-seeking behavior. Now lobbyists aren't even necessary because there's no reason to lobby because the EPA doesn't exist.
You joke, but I think Trump's regulatory moratorium has probably mitigated rent-seeking behavior far more than somebody like Bernie Sanders would. I mean,
yeah, of course it would have, by definition, okay. Of course, yeah.
Okay, well, then if it's the most important thing for you to care about, then I think you should care. You should be more supportive.
This is like saying somebody comes into the hospital and they've got a massive slash on their arm, and it's like, well, the most important thing is to stop the bleeding in the arm, right? You're like, yes. It's like, okay, well, let's amputate it. Like, well, now there you go. Now we fixed the problem.
That at all.
Like you're saying that, like, well, if we can, Trump has deregulated a lot of shit, and now there's not as much lobbying. Of course, because there's nothing to lobby for, because they've already gotten what they've wanted by reducing the amount of...
Okay, but if your number one goal is to reduce the influence of money in politics, and that you should like that.
Okay.
You can laugh, but it's true.
No, because you're being so fucking dishonest. So,
I'm not
Destiny, your number one goal, you're saying your number one goal, Destiny, is to reduce... You're saying that you care about the most about money in politics, Destiny. And I'm like, yeah, I want to get money in politics. Well, Destiny, if you just give the companies everything they want, they won't have to lobby anymore. So now is that your most important thing? Well, I don't know, Exskillsme, you sure got me there. Like,
well, I don't know. It's kind of like it's what you value. If you tell me that the most important thing to you is to mitigate the influence of money in politics, but you support the candidate who would most incentivize the role of money in politics, and you hate most the candidate that would most reduce the amount of influence of money in politics, then it calls into question the idea that you care most about this situation. I'm not saying you have to.
And this gets back earlier to where we can be recursive infinitely with this if you really want to be. Like,
I don't know. It would be kind of like saying I support illegal immigration, so I support Donald Trump. It's exactly what it's like. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Okay. Do you want to crystallize anything else? I'll give you the final word, like Bill O'Reilly would.
Final word. Okay, sure. I wasn't ready for this, but basically, I guess all I'll say is I really don't think money in politics is what you care about most. I think if you did, you would have more researched answers on exactly how Bernie would do that. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really bad excuse for you to support Bernie Sanders because his policies, like his $15 minimum wage, are far more idiotic than anything Trump has proposed. Gotcha. But I think you kind of lean on that as your excuse to support him. Okay. And I don't think you have an excuse because the political economy and the way that the market works really doesn't provide a basis for you to say that you support Bernie Sanders because you'll think he'll reduce the amount of money in politics. So, all right, thanks.
All right, I love you, buddy. I appreciate the conversation.
Love you too, man.
Stay safe, night. Okay?
All right, bye.
What's up, my dude?
Are you happy with that conversation? Do you feel proud about what just happened?
I consider Exskillsme to be, he can construct things in very intelligent ways, and I think that my frustration when talking to him represents a shortcoming of my own that I have to address.
If you want to reduce the number of dudes asking you to suck their...
So, from what I understand, the base failure, let's call it, in that conversation was, while you say your first priority is money in politics, the actual priority is blunting the effects that money has in politics, right?
Yes, yeah, correct.
So you want to blunt these negative regulations or, the stoppage of
positive the money itself isn't really the thing. That's fucking stupid to assume, right? Yeah.
Right. See, here's the thing. Anyone with a fucking brain understands that, so why are you talking to someone who doesn't?
Yeah, but the problem is that if he can twist the words around like that, and I can't identify that quick enough, then that represents a shortcoming of my own. That like that, and I agree with you there, right? But and I kind of caught it later, but I should be able to catch those things instantly. But if I can't, then it represents a shortcoming that I have that I need to work on when I talk to people.
Not the usual decades. This was more buttmates.
Yeah.
I'm working right now, so I don't have a ton of time.
Yeah, I understand. I'm
through that, dude.
I'm sorry. I know. But it's something that I have to work on in identifying what people are talking about and keeping conversation centered. It's like an important like live discussion thing. But in terms of like being a productive discussion, I understand. I think that he's like, if you've ever seen me talk to him in the past or seen like his subreddit posts, like he's very, very dishonest in the way that he uses language. But it's a really good exercise in terms of identifying that and moving forward, knowing that you can identify that. Like that's something that I have to work on a lot because a lot of people use that type of rhetoric,
Yeah, I know, but listen, there's no reason. Like, I know you think that this is like a constructive exercise for you, but what did you really get out of that?
It's just more practice doing it in a live format. I'm a big believer in that, like you learn better by doing. That like reading books on how to identify that doesn't really help me. Sure.
I understand that. But what did you learn specifically from that conversation?
Well, specifically in that, I mean, at the very least, I learned on this single issue that I'm not actually against the letter of getting money out of politics, but more that the destructive impact that money in politics has is something that I would seek to avoid. So I guess if somebody brought up that hyper-specific issue in the future, I would know about it. But I guess it also, in a general sense, it gives me the idea that sometimes things that you are against in society, you're not necessarily against those specific things, but rather the effects of those specific things. I guess it's a more general idea to think about.
Right. Sure, and that's fine. But see, here's the thing. That's really a semantic difference, and in almost every single case, right, that you will be discussing that will be implicit.
But not. But I argue with a lot of people that you wouldn't want me to argue with that are really disingenuous. So I think that being able to identify those types of tactics are really important. I guess, or I feel that way.
Yeah, you've been doing better, by the way, lately, buddy.
Thanks. I try.
Like up until like right now, but.
Well, he's like the master level, like, dishonest wordsmith, okay? So that's why I say he's like a really good, like, if I can have an argument with Exskillsme, right? Because there were a few times in this discussion where I was able to identify, there was one that I remember where he said something that we definitely didn't have like an agreement on, because he does a thing where like he'll give a word and then he'll be playing with a different definition and he'll know that you don't agree with, like the lobbying thing. Oh, he did it with the lobbying thing, right? Where he knows probably what I think about when I think of lobbying, but then he like pretends that I'm using a more general definition, and then he kind of strawmans me and attacks that position, and then I'm left like defending things that I wouldn't really want to defend. Like for instance, like a corporation providing like a presentation to a politician about why something would be better. Obviously, I would never be against something like that, right? But he kind of strawmans me into defending that position and then attacks it and makes my argument look ridiculous. I think that being able to identify that kind of stuff in a live format is really, really, really important, I think.
Right, but do you think that's something that you have difficulty with now? Like you didn't.
Well, I just did have difficulty with him, didn't I? I mean.
Well, okay. Let's put it this way. You didn't have difficulty identifying the problem necessarily. You had difficulty putting it into words, and the problem there was you didn't even have difficulty identifying the problem or putting it into words in every single case. It just happened over and over and over and over again.
Well, but look, the next person that I take on,
fucking talk to those people.
But the next person that I talk to that tries to do that, man, I'm gonna catch him real quick because of my experience talking to Exskillsme. All right.
Or maybe you'll just fucking kill yourself because you have too much of it.
Okay, go back to work. I love you, buddy. Thanks.
Yeah, peace out, man.
All right, bye.